All right, we know there is a lot of Oracle documentations available from tahiti.oracle.com. In the database 11G release R2, there's a section about grid computing. Okay. And you'll find within this section, three documents that you'll find very useful. This deal with databases that runs on a cluster. So this documentation deal with how to deploy a database that is running on an already established cluster. While this documentation deal with clusterware only. From what I've surveyed from the group, everybody has an extensive background as DBAs. So as far as the database administration, there isn't a whole lot of new things here. Okay. And I think the most trouble will come, or at least the biggest learning curve, will actually come from these two components here on the clusterware and the ASM. So that's why the first 3 days we'll spend a good amount of time on these. So these are the three essential documents that you should have available at all times. Okay. Now, what is not here is the actual installation documentation. Okay. Now, the installation documentation can be found by looking at the installing and upgrading section, where the Linux installation guide or platform-specific installation guide can be found. So, for example, if you are looking to find out prerequisites for installing grid controls, or it's not grid controls, grid infrastructures, you can find this documentation, Grid Infrastructure Installation Guide. Okay. Correct. The website, the official website here is tahiti.oracle.com. And you should go to the database 11GR2 link, and the two section where you'll find the most authoritative references are the grid computing and installing and upgrading. Now, what makes these documentations are very accessible as long as you know which ones to look for. If you need help on installing a grid infrastructure on a Linux or on any platforms, you want to start with the installation and upgrading. This deal with prerequisites, kernel parameters, required packages and libraries, user accounts, permissions, Oracle base directories, Oracle home directories, and pretty much all the things we have done on day one can be found as a walkthrough from this documentation. And subsequently, you will need this guide within the grid computing to administer the clusterware properly. You need to refer to this administration and deployment guide, which you will find information about the tool CRS-CTL, how to manage OCRs and how to manage voting disks, how to stop and start resources, and also, most importantly, within this documentation, while you may not immediately find them useful, but I really consider one of a strength of the Oracle Clusterware. Okay, now that is section 6, called Making Application Highly Available Using Clusterware. Now, this Oracle Clusterware is not just designed for Oracle databases, although most of the times you deploy them because you need to manage an Oracle database. But this clusterware is a general purpose clusterware that can support applications, web server applications, your J2E applications, and so on. Enterprise managers. Okay. The reason why you might use clusterware over third-party clustering software may be the fact that you may have a cluster build, and building a cluster is expensive, and you have the computer resources. When you start introducing application as a resource into the clusterware, now you can dynamically control the capacity of these applications. So let's say you have a 10 node cluster. There really is no requirement that says you must use 10 machines as databases. There's absolutely no reason why you cannot use some of those machines as an app server sometimes, and all of them as database sometimes, or all of them as app server, or any mix in between. You can dynamically shift your workload between app server and database. Now you can even create associations between multiple resources. For example, in order to run X J2E application, you must have a database, and you may want this database to run as closely to the app server as possible, so they run as a single unit. Or you may want the application to run on separate machines than the database. Or you may want database to run exclusively without any other application running on it. You may associate a VIP address with the J2EE application, so whenever this application is starting, a virtual IP is associated and is bound to the machine that's hosting the app. So Module 6 will show you how to introduce a script, an application style resource, and use a script agent to provide a script to the script agent to run a start script, a shutdown script, a check script, and a board script, and so on. Okay. Now, although you may not find this what you would consider as a frequent use case when it comes down to DBA duty, but I know some of you are application server DBA as well. Now, you may find this to be useful when you come to terms with the fact that cluster is built, cool, we have a set of hardware all tied together. Now, how can we make best use of it? Of course, we have the standard way of hosting databases across machine. Now, that wouldn't be that much different than, say, Oracle Parallel Server or things that came prior to Rack. Okay, that isn't a whole lot different. Now, the reason why we introduced Clusterware is that we need a platform to actually enable grid computing. So here is a pool of resource, 10 machines. We can have it run app server, we can have it run database, and we can have it run very dynamically. So this section, although commonly overlooked, is very important. Cluster verification utilities. This is the Cluffy utility reference. Okay. And we know it has a lot of settings, and of course just walk you through how to call these functionalities from the cluster verification. Clusterware resource references. Now, defining a resource is not the most straightforward thing to do because it's comprehensive. This defines resources, and there's a ton of parameters that help you define a resource. Some of the parameter requires you to say if your resource has dependencies to other resources, how many instances of this resource should run. For example, scan listener should have 3 instances, have 3 cardinality for rack scan. It doesn't have to be hard-coded to any specific member. So these, when you define a resource, you can optionally specify all of these attributes. There's a lot of them. Okay. But you need to understand these in order to define a resource properly that is highlighted in section 6. So whenever you look at a resource, a scan listener, a database, an ASM disk group, so on and so forth, these are all cluster resources, and they're defined a certain way. And this gives you the lowdown of everything about the resource. If a resource dies, how many restart attempts? Okay. To start the process, you can specify a set of dependencies. So it's all very comprehensive. There are hard dependencies, so you must have another resource available. For example, in order for us to start a cluster where there's a hard dependencies on ASM disk to be available, and so on and so forth. Okay, sorry, in order to start a database, you may have to have an ASM disk group available, and so on. So you can create these dependencies between resources, and it's Clusterware's job to make sure these dependencies are satisfied. And OLS nodes, this simply lists out the nodes that's part of the cluster. So one quick way, you can try this out real quick, OLS nodes. It'll tell you that your cluster is currently made out of 2 nodes. Perfect. All right. And there's some odd and ends, but I rarely use anything but just OLS nodes. Now, OIF config, that's your interface configuration. Let's suppose you want to introduce another private adapter. You can use this. Let's say you want to introduce another network where VIP can be bound to. You can do this. So for example, you decided that your cluster should have a third interface only to run Java apps, J2EE apps. You can use OIF config to introduce another network, like 192.168.3 network, to the cluster. Okay, that's the interface configuration tool. Usually your sysadmin should be familiar with it, as calling these tools requires root privileges. All right, CRS CTL utility reference. This is the big motherload of all switches CRS CTL related. Okay. All right, so this is the GUI that interface your Clusterware API and your Clusterware objects. And these are the common things that you do. And there's also a C programming interface. I know you have some code to develop in C. All the functionality available in CRCTL is available exposed through the C API. Okay. Now this is a section that we're going to start our afternoon talking about the various utility that deal with Oracle Cluster Registry OCR. It's important because all of the resource that you define lives in the cluster registry. And last and finally, in the Appendix C, this is where you can find your log files. Where are they? I think I've highlighted a few of the important ones, such as the alert logs. Okay. But these individual daemon logs has sometimes too much information to be useful. Okay. And that's where the alert logs are.